It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. The streets of the city were damp from an evening rain, the slick pavement reflecting the flickering streetlights above. It wasn't particularly late, but the chill in the air made the city seem quieter than usual, as if the world was holding its breath. People hurried home, their footsteps echoing through the alleys and along the dimly lit roads. But for one woman, it was the beginning of something far more unsettling than she could have ever imagined. Her name was Sarah Thompson. She was a young woman, full of ambition and curiosity, with a mind that never stopped asking questions. She worked long hours at a nearby bookstore, a quiet place tucked away in the heart of the city, filled with the smell of old paper and dust. Most evenings she would walk home, a brisk 10-minute walk through the busy streets. But tonight, as she turned the corner, she noticed something different. The streets, though busy earlier, now seemed desolate, an unsettling stillness hung in the air. It was as if something was waiting. She had always considered herself brave, never one to shy away from the unknown. But tonight, the weight of the silence felt different. It was thick and suffocating, and every shadow seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. She tugged the collar of her coat tighter around her neck, quickening her pace, but the feeling of unease followed her every step. Then it happened. As she crossed the intersection, a car pulled up beside her. It was a taxi, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The vehicle was old, its paint chipped, the headlights dim, as though it had been on the road for far longer than it should have been. The windows were fogged, and the driver's seat was empty, but the door swung open as if to beckon her inside. Sarah stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She'd never seen this taxi before, and it didn't belong here, not in this part of the city. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to continue walking and forget the strange feeling creeping up her spine. But something in the air held her there, something pulling at her. She peered inside the car. The back seat was empty. There was no sign of the driver, but the door was still open. It was then that the voice came, a soft, almost whispering tone from somewhere within the car. It sounded like it was calling her name, but in a way that felt both familiar and off. "Sarah, come inside. I'll take you home." Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around, but the streets were still empty. There was no one else in sight. A strange kind of urgency pressed against her chest, urging her to make a decision. She didn't know why, but the voice seemed so comforting, so inviting, like it belonged to someone she knew, someone she trusted. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward. Her feet carried her to the open door, her hand reaching out almost against her will. As soon as she touched the handle, a strange chill shot through her fingers, numbing them instantly. But she ignored it. She slid into the back seat, the air inside the cab colder than the night air outside. The doors shut with a soft click, and Sarah looked up. The driver's seat was still empty, but the car slowly began to move. It glided silently down the street, as if it was being pushed by an invisible hand. Sarah felt her heart race, but the ride was strangely smooth, almost soothing, as if she were floating rather than driving. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling just slightly. The voice came again, low and smooth, like it was just behind her. "Home, Sarah. I'll take you home." She glanced out the window. The city's familiar streets blurred past, but there was something off about it. The buildings seemed different, older, darker, as if the entire neighborhood had been swallowed by time. The streets she knew so well twisted and turned in ways she didn't recognize. The bright lights, the bustling shops, the people walking the sidewalks, they were gone. In their place was only darkness, and a fog that had begun to creep in from the edges of the city. The car moved faster, the eerie silence stretching between them, and Sarah's unease deepened. The air inside the taxi had grown even colder. Her breath came in visible clouds, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something wasn't right. She had to ask again. "Who are you?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed on, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The voice in the darkness smiled, a sound that seemed to echo in the car, though the figure in the front seat remained unseen. "You don't recognize me, do you?" "Don't worry, Sarah. I'm someone you'll never forget. The cab continued to drive, the world outside growing more distorted with every passing second. The streets were darker now, the fog thicker. Sarah's grip on the seat tightened as the buildings around her seemed to blur into something else entirely, something ancient, forgotten. The very air felt as though it was thick with memories, haunting, like the remnants of a past that no one had dared to remember. As the taxi sped through the city, Sarah felt herself growing dizzy. The streetlights that had once illuminated her path now flickered like dying stars. She tried to speak, to ask more questions, but her voice felt muffled, as if the words were slipping through the air and vanishing before they could reach her lips. And then, everything changed. The taxi came to an abrupt halt, the screech of the tires against the pavement jarring in the quiet night. Sarah's heart skipped as she looked out the window. The world outside had disappeared entirely. There was no city, no street. Just an endless stretch of fog, stretching out into an unknown void. The voice in the back seat was louder now, more insistent. "You've arrived, Sarah. Welcome home." Her stomach twisted in fear. She opened the door to find herself standing on the edge of an old, decaying street, so familiar yet so wrong. The buildings were falling apart, their windows shattered, doors hanging ajar. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the silence was deafening. Sarah turned back to the cab. But there was no driver. The back seat was empty. The taxi was gone. She was alone in a place she didn't recognize, standing on the edge of a town that shouldn't exist, the fog swirling around her like the ghostly whispers of those who had vanished before her. And then, the ground beneath her began to shake. A sound like thunder rumbled through the air, and from the fog, figures began to emerge, shadowy forms, tall and gaunt, moving with an unnatural grace. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their footsteps echoed through the fog. They were waiting for her. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears as she stood frozen, her body gripped by an unexplainable terror. The figures in the fog were getting closer, their movements smooth and unnervingly silent. Each one was taller than any person she had ever seen, their faces obscured by the mist that seemed to swirl around them like a cloak. Their eyes, however, glowed, piercing, cold, and endless, like two distant stars that refused to blink. She tried to move, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, her legs shaking with fear. The world around her was distorted, the fog thickening as though it was alive, creeping in from all directions, swallowing everything in its path. The tall figures closed in on her, their presence suffocating, and she knew, deep down, that there was nowhere to run. A voice echoed through the fog, familiar yet distant, as though it had been waiting for her. "Welcome home, Sarah." The words sent a chill racing down her spine, but she couldn't turn away. The voice wasn't from any of the figures in front of her. It came from everywhere at once, surrounding her, twisting through the fog like a whisper that couldn't be ignored. She was drowning in it, drowning in the feeling of being hunted, of being pulled deeper into the unknown. One of the figures stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it knew it held power over her. The air around Sarah grew colder, and the faint glow of the figure's eyes pierced through the fog, locking onto hers. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a hesitant step back, but the fog seemed to press in on her, preventing any escape. "You don't remember us, do you?" The voice continued, its tone almost mocking, like it found amusement in her confusion. "But you will. You'll remember everything." Sarah's mind spun, the weight of the words settling on her chest. She had no idea what was happening, why these figures, these things, were speaking to her like this. She didn't recognize them, didn't understand what was happening to her, or why the world around her had become so twisted, so wrong. "You were always meant to be here," the voice continued, growing louder now. "You've always belonged to this place. You've just forgotten." The fog seemed to move with the voice, curling around Sarah's legs, rising higher with each passing second. She felt trapped, ensnared by something ancient, something far older than she could comprehend. The more the voice spoke, the more she felt herself slipping, falling into a place she couldn't escape from. But then, a figure stepped forward, closer still, its form becoming clearer in the shifting mist. This one was different. While the others remained in the shadows, its face seemed more defined. It was taller than the others, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes, those piercing eyes, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "I remember you, Sarah," it said, its voice deeper than the others, tinged with something almost familiar. "You were one of us. You just don't know it yet." A cold tremor ran through Sarah's body, and she staggered back, finally breaking free from the invisible grip that had held her still. She turned, running, no, stumbling, through the thick fog, her legs weak beneath her as the figures closed in. She could hear their footsteps, heavy and relentless, echoing in the distance, but they didn't seem to be moving as fast as she was. It was almost as though they were letting her escape. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, like it was swallowing her path, the earth beneath her cracking with every step. She glanced behind her, half expecting the figures to be right on her heels, but when she looked back, the fog seemed to be closing in, wrapping around her like a tightening noose. In the distance, a shadowy outline appeared, an old, crumbling building looming in the fog. It looked like an abandoned house, its windows dark and empty. Something about it called to her, its silhouette just visible through the mist. It was the only thing in sight. Without thinking, without knowing why, Sarah ran toward it. The door creaked as she pushed it open, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air inside the house was thick, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the room. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the floor creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a light from somewhere deep within the house. But the feeling of being watched, of being pulled deeper into something, was overwhelming. She turned in a circle, her eyes searching for anything familiar, anything that could explain what was happening to her. But there was nothing. Just shadows, stretching and shifting, dancing in the corners of the room. A soft sound echoed from the darkened hallway behind her, and she spun around. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, its form obscured by the shadows. But Sarah knew, without a doubt, that it was one of them. The same ones who had followed her, the same ones who had been speaking to her. And it was coming closer. Her chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat as the figure began to move toward her. She had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. She ran down the hall, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty house, until she reached the first door she could find. She flung it open, her heart racing as she stepped inside. The room was dark, save for a single light in the corner, flickering erratically. It was a bedroom, old, with antique furniture and a faded rug on the floor. The bed, however, was the most unsettling thing in the room. It was perfectly made, the sheets stretched tight, and yet, the air around it felt wrong. The room seemed to pulse with an energy that made her skin crawl. She stepped closer, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And then she saw it, a figure lying under the covers. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a dark, twisted form that seemed to shimmer and warp in the dim light. The sheets moved slightly as though something underneath them was breathing. Sarah froze. She felt an icy hand of dread clutch at her heart. "You've always been one of us, Sarah." The voice echoed through her mind, a whisper that slid into her thoughts like a serpent. She stepped back, her head spinning, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure on the bed slowly sat up. It wasn't human. The figure on the bed shifted, its movements slow and unnatural, as though it were taking its time to fully materialize. Sarah's breath hitched, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what she was seeing. The thing that had risen from the bed was not like anything human. It had no discernible face, just a blank, featureless surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. Its skin shimmered, like black smoke swirling just beneath the surface, flickering in and out of existence. Its body was tall and slender, but the limbs were elongated, unnaturally long, like the arms and legs of something that didn't belong in this world. "Sarah!" The voice came again, only this time it wasn't just in her mind. It was in the room with her, soft, whispered, as if the very air around her was speaking. She stumbled backward, her legs shaking with fear, as the thing stood up. It was like a shadow brought to life, a wraith made of darkness that stretched and bent in ways that defied reason. The floor creaked beneath its weight, but it moved with a fluid grace, sliding toward her with a motion that was far too smooth, too quick. The shadows in the room seemed to respond to its presence, growing darker, swirling in a chaotic dance. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the air in her lungs had frozen, trapped in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. All she could do was watch in horror as the thing drew closer, its formless face looming larger with each step. "You have always belonged to us, Sarah," the voice whispered again, the tone cold and final. "We never left you. We were always watching, waiting for the moment when you would remember." Her chest tightened as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had heard those words before. She had heard them when she first stepped into the ghostly taxi. The voice had called to her from the moment she entered that cursed cab. It was the same voice, the same presence that had guided her into this nightmare. "I don't understand," Sarah managed to choke out, her voice hoarse and weak. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself against the cold floor. "What do you want from me?" The thing paused for a moment, its form twisting and shifting in the dim light. Then it moved closer, its presence overwhelming. It reached out toward her, its long, elongated fingers hovering just inches from her face. The temperature in the room dropped, and she felt the cold touch of its fingers on her skin, sending a shock of ice through her veins. "We want what is ours," it said, the voice now a whisper in her ear, full of malice. "You were never meant to leave. You belong to this place, Sarah. You always have." Suddenly, everything clicked. The taxi, the fog, the figures, this place, this nightmare, it was all connected. The ancient dark force that had drawn her in was not just in the town. It was part of her. She had been chosen, marked, and now she had come back to claim what was hers. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah as the room seemed to twist around her. The walls grew closer, the ceiling lowering as if the house itself was alive, suffocating her with its dark power. The figure stood over her now, its presence looming like an insurmountable weight. The voice inside her mind spoke again, this time clearer than before. "We are the forgotten ones, Sarah. We are the souls who were lost to time. And you are our key. You are the one who will open the door." The floor beneath her feet trembled as if something deep below the house was awakening. A deep, resonant sound reverberated through the walls, a hum that vibrated in Sarah's chest, making her feel like she was being pulled down into the earth itself. "The door," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. "What door?" The thing leaned closer, its shadowy form filling her vision, its eyes now glowing a pale blue, burning with a cold, unnatural fire. "The door to the place beyond the veil. The place where we reside. The place where you belong," it said. "Once you open it, there will be no turning back." Sarah felt the weight of its words sinking into her very soul. She understood now. This wasn't just a haunted town or a ghostly taxi. It was something far older, something that had been waiting for her, drawing her in, claiming her as its own. She tried to stand, tried to fight, but her legs were weak, and the room seemed to spin around her. The air was thick with the weight of the unseen, pressing in on her, making it harder to breathe. Suddenly, the figure moved back, stepping away from her. Sarah looked up, confused, and saw the door to the bedroom, the one she had come through, now standing wide open. Beyond it, she could see the faintest glimpse of something. A light, pale and flickering, as if something was moving just outside the room. Without thinking, she scrambled to her feet and ran toward the door. But before she could reach it, a cold hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her back with an unnatural force. "No," the voice whispered. "You cannot leave. Not yet." The figure's grip tightened, and Sarah felt herself being pulled back into the center of the room. She struggled, trying to break free, but it was useless. The force was too strong, the power of whatever force had claimed this place was too great. And then, as if in response to her struggles, the light outside the room flickered, growing brighter, more intense. The ground beneath her feet shook again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the house that was moving. It was something else. Something ancient, something powerful. The figure looked at her, its face still featureless, but the air around it crackled with energy. "The door is almost open," it said. "But it will not be you who opens it." Before Sarah could react, the room seemed to shift, everything blurred, the walls, the floor, the shadows, all of it spinning, warping in a dizzying motion. The very air itself seemed to bend and twist, and Sarah felt herself being pulled, dragged into the heart of the darkness. Her scream was lost in the void as the light from beyond the room engulfed her completely, swallowing her whole. And then, there was nothing.